I got my buddy's 572 rotating assembly away from him. It's a Cali's top of the line, their Magnum crank, USA made. The Cali's Ultra rods, their best rods, and the Diamond custom pistons. I would say the only thing wrong with this is when this project started, it was supposed to be a budget build, and these parts have kind of violated the budget, but at least we have parts. Oh, by the way, I went by the crankshaft guy today, and of course he hadn't done my other crank yet. It's only been over 6 months, so I picked it up, so that nightmare's over. Well, the block's ready to go, and so all I'll have to do is check the clearances on all of this, and we'll go to putting it together. The first thing I would start with, I know this sounds trivial, but the galley plugs. I could tell you a horror story about a mud dauber getting in a guy's oil system, but he wouldn't like me to tell about that. So, if you start with these first, if you've got a street Hemi block, this wouldn't apply. You probably don't use these. But because it's easy to forget later, and you'll hear some people say they had to take their engine back, tear their engine back down because they forgot to put these in. So go ahead and put them in now, and that way you won't forget. I don't bother sealing these because I don't think it matters. I mean, if the oil comes by it, it wouldn't matter, and if it gets loose, it wouldn't matter. It's just going to come up to the head. On these interior oil plugs, I don't bother to seal those because if it leaks a drop in 100 miles, I don't think that's going to hurt anything. It's going in the oil pan. Now the ones on the back of the block, that's in the bell housing, so you have to seal those. But you don't want to put anything on the first two threads. I don't know what you're going to use, be it Teflon tape or I use liquid Teflon, but you don't want to get anything in your oil system. So don't put anything on the first two threads. Just put it back here and then tighten it up, and then you can wipe off the excess that comes out. If you're using this fitting or any ORB fitting where you've got that bevel there and for the O-ring to seal up against. Now, as you can imagine, dry rubber on clean steel or cast iron, it's not going to want to slide. So you'll want to oil this up and oil up the O-ring so it'll let it slide as you're tightening it up. I use they've got those AN wrenches, but the old crescents that have a big wide jaw fit better on that particular fitting because it's so wide. You know, these are easy to damage because they're aluminum. So that's what I'll do. I'll start with the plugs and the little things like that. I'll get all that done. And then the first thing I will put in is the cam. I do the cam first because when you get the crank in, you can't get your hands in there to support the cam on its way in. So let's get the cam out and get it cleaned up. I don't clean stuff up and then put it all together. Look at that speck of something on there. I clean everything up as I go, each item one at a time, because that way I know it didn't get dirty from sitting in here for days or weeks or months waiting, you know. And of course, anytime you get stopped on your work, you need to cover it up with a big garbage bag. You'll have to get the 55-gallon kind at Walmart. A regular trash bag, you know, won't work. It's not big enough when you get the oil pan on it. So get a big 55-gallon and then cover it up whenever you're going to be away for any amount of time, because bad things can happen. I'll get the cam and we'll take a look at it. Now it's time to clean up the cam and put it in. In reality, you're not supposed to do too much cleaning up on the cam. The manufacturers tell you not to take a Brillo pad and shine this up shiny. They say this black stuff on here protects it. So you really don't do much cleaning up. You get it clean. There's really only one thing you really need to worry about. That is these two holes in the number 4 journal. Depending on what your model block you're putting in, they do different things. The Street Hemi block, well, it's not like a wedge. On a wedge, these oil the rocker arms. But we know, and that's why when you're priming a wedge, you have to turn the motor over until this one hole lines up with the oil supply, and this goes to the rocker. And when you're priming it, you'll hear it pull down when it gets pressure built up, and then when you turn it and line those holes up, you'll hear the drill motor speed up, and you stop there until it fills that up and pulls the motor down. Then you turn it again to do the other side. But on a Hemi, actually that groove will, Hemi has full-time oil to the rocker arms, so that's what that groove does. So now yes, these work also, but the groove will give you 100% oil, which is why you don't have to turn a Hemi over when you're oiling, when you're pre-oiling. But, and then later on, of course, the blocks, not the ones that came in the cars, but these later model blocks, they actually feed from the lifter galley. So it has full-time oiling by those means, and that's why we put those restrictors, as we call them. They don't really restrict, but in the deck, like we did the very first plug we put in. But oil still gets in these holes, and it works back and forth. And if you don't clean that hole out, whatever is in there, and you know there's manufacturing debris in there, and there's dirt in there, and there's stuff they sprayed in there, if you don't clean those holes out, then it's going to get in your oil. So clean those holes. Get you a cheap brush somewhere and clean those holes out. And that's the only really thing you have to clean up on the cam. And then when we put it in, we'll just, I use motor oil on these, and then on the lobes themselves, just use some, this is Comp Cam's, use some lube on there. You know, we have to break in the cam, you know. So use their lube on the lobes. And they say you can use that on the distributor gear too, but this we really have to talk about because, as you know, there's oil pressure going to the main things in the engine, but there's other parts of the engine that are splash lubricated. Well, there's no lube going to the distributor gear. And so it's up to you to provide oil here until the splash lube can get on there. So this is all up to you. You're the only one that's going to oil that. So I use heavier stuff here because that's a kind of a stressful situation. I use the 50-50 oil STP mix, and that's fine. And if you're using a mechanical fuel pump, of course you're going to have to lube your fuel pump lobe. But so no big cleanup here. Just only thing you need to worry about is those holes. As far as cleaning, the rest of it is just brush it off with Varsol or whatever you use to clean something up, and then lube up the. It's easier to get your hands all messy and lube these here than to put it in the block and then try to do it through the lifter holes. That's too much trouble. You can do a better job just lubing it out here before you slide it in. Before we put the crankshaft in, first we have to put this block off plate on because we won't have room once the crank gets in there. This block off plate, I really like it, and it's all CNC deburred, chamfered around the corners and everything. Really nice stuff. But when I put it in there, I worry a lot. And I got to worrying about this not sealing up good enough and sucking air. And you don't want your oil pump sucking air instead of oil. And so I didn't like that idea. So what are we going to do to fix that? Well, you can't really use silicone or sealant on this because it's involved in the oil system, and that's a no-no. You don't want anything being able to suck into your oil. What we really need is a O-ring like this, is like on your oil pump. That's what we want, but we're not going to get that. That's above my pay grade to try to do that. That'd take me a week. So I decided I'd make a gasket. That's going to be fine, but I spent 2 hours trying to find my gasket punch set, and I can't find it. So I ordered one on Amazon. It's supposed to be here tomorrow. Okay, I've checked the crank out and everything looked great. It was straight to within 1/10. The nose was a few tenths big, it looked like. I don't have a Mopar spec on what the nose is supposed to be, but when you're running a aftermarket crank and an aftermarket balancer, you often have to hone the balancer, so that's what I'll have to do on that. If anybody knows the real Mopar spec on what size that is supposed to be, I'd love to know. Of course, before you put this in, they spray stuff to protect this thing before they put it in the box, and that's why it's so pretty. But you've got to clean it up. You see how shiny that hole is? It wasn't that way before I cleaned out the passages. So the oil comes in the main bearings, of course, and goes out to the rod bearings. And unless you want all the trash in that hole going to your rod bearings, you have to clean these out. I use lacquer thinner. You can use Varsol, whatever you think does a good job. I just like lacquer thinner for that. But take your brush, clean all these passages out. There'll be 8 of them, one going to each rod, and come in from both directions. And before you put it in the block, be sure you put some oil on your thrust bearing here too. I know you got some on the bearings, but play it safe. Put some oil on here too. Okay, I've got the studs in and the valley plugs and everything. I've got the cam in. Now it's time to put in the crank. So I cleaned up the main bores, got everything real clean, and snapped in the bearings. Just put those in dry. Now it's time for the crank. Only a couple things to remember here. Number one is you'll oil this, but then this is not pressure lubricated really. After you get it running, you'll get some pressure out of here and you'll get some splash and everything will be fine. But on initial startup, this is actually going to be dry if you don't put something on there. So smear some oil on the sides of your center bearing, your thrust bearing, and that'll be fine. The rear main seal, I don't do anything special there. Of course, you know that the lip goes to the inside. I do clock that a little bit, not much, maybe a 1/4 inch or so. Just, in other words, you don't want the parting line of the seal to be at the parting line of the cap. So that's all. And I've never had a leaker really, but I hear about all these horror stories on the internet. It always scares me, and I think I'm doing something wrong. But everything should be fine there. And you also have to oil the seal and oil the part of the crankshaft that the seal rides on. that gets no oil either. So oil that up. And it says if you aren't going to start it for several days, grease is recommended. Well, you know this thing's never going to crank before spring, so white lithium grease would be a better choice, and I'll smear some of that on there and on where it rides on the back of the crankshaft. And then everything will be fine. Now I'll wrestle the crank. Okay, the crankshaft is in. Now we want to do a preliminary thrust clearance check before we start tightening things up, just to make sure we're okay. So we give it some love taps. We're okay there. Now we tap it back. 5/1000ths. So we're good there. So now we'll put some main caps on and see how things go. Now we're going to put the main caps on. Hopefully, if you have a block that's made like this one where it's machined up straight here, and this was very sharp, so filed that off at a 45. If you've got a real sharp corner there, as you put the main cap on, it might push trash. Of course, if it pushes any trash down there, it's going right where your cap's trying to sit, and that's not nice. So hopefully you've deburred that part. And as you know, this goes together tang to tang on here. And this is all pretty easy. Lubricate this, let this slide easy, and lubricate down here where this seats. So everything will slide together easy. Don't feel bad about checking your work 50 times because you're trying to do it right. You know, I should have got my bigger hammer for this. I think it would do a better job. All right. I'll put the other 4 caps on and ARP lube the threads and the top side of the washer and torque everything down. Then we will recheck the thrust clearance. Make sure we didn't mess anything up. Okay, now let's recheck our thrust clearance after main caps are torqued. I've got it on 0 and gave it a few love taps here. Now come back the other way. And we've got the same 5,000. So, life is good. While we're standing here, I think I should mention how nice this crankshaft balance job is. Notice how they machined the front and the rear to where they don't have to do as much drilling. You know, you see those crankshafts where they've got holes drilled that deep, and that looks tacky. And this is a much better way to do it. Just really nice stuff. Although he got this rotating assembly from Ray Barton, I don't know if Ray did the balance or if Ray orders it from Callie's balance. So I don't know who did it. All I know is it looks better than a lot of others I've seen. This rear main seal, I forgot to mention a while ago, I use that ultra black on the sides and I'm sure I use too much like everybody else because I'm paranoid about having an oil leak. And that's why you want this super clean. I don't know if it sticks good to something that's oily or not. All I want to do is everything I possibly can to keep it from leaking. So, wipe that off with either Windex and a paper towel or lacquer thinner or something where it's real clean, where that ultra black will. It makes me think it's going to work better. I don't know if it does. But this seal, look, can you see that knot right there? I mean, look at that. I think they dropped this off the second story or something. That's terrible. If you see something like that, you're going to have to take a fine file or a stone like this and stone it down. I mean, maybe it wouldn't leak with all that ultra black, but it's going to hold it up, It's terrible. So, like always, keep your eyes open. Okay, the crank and cam are in, and now I'll go get the rods and pistons ready to install.